welcome to another philosophical conversation. I'm here with two friends of the channel, David McKerracher and Ann Snelgrove, and we're here to discuss a new course that is on offer with Theory Underground, which starts Sunday, June 11th. It will run for 6 months. However, they'll be meeting only once per month, so not a big time commitment, but also stretched out over a long time, 6 months, meeting on the second Sunday of every month. And the course is titled Digital Literacy and Critical Media Theory. There'll be links in the description to all of that below. And the point of the course, Digital Literacy and Critical Media Theory, will be to, one, focus on the foundations of media theory, partially through the work of Marshall McLuhan, but also to give a foundation which helps people understand critical media theory. And without that background in media theory and without that foundation of McLuhan, the possibility of engaging in critical media theory and the possibility of cultivating digital literacy is perhaps an impossible task. So a much needed course, especially in the context of a hyper-digital, hyper-connected society where media is more and more infiltrating and perhaps in a McLuhan sense, distorting and playing with our senses in a way that takes us away from our normal sense of immediacy as we would perhaps have existed throughout most of our pre-human history. So welcome, or prehistory, as you say. So welcome both Dave and Ann. Maybe just introduce yourselves, give a little bit of overview of what's going on with this course, and then we'll jump into a conversation which will primarily be focused on an interview with Marshall McLuhan from 1969.
Right. Well, Ann, would you like to start?
Sure, yeah. My name is Ann Snelgrove. I am Dave's current fiance, but also just a fellow traveler in the world of theory and Theory Underground. I have helped teach one course previously with Theory Underground, The Idea of the University, and I'm really excited to be a co-teacher for this course as well. The kind of current fiance. Sorry. I don't know.
Say it's like I'm like I've had a whole string of fiancés.
You're right. Yeah. I'm Dave's fourth fiance. No, I'm Dave's only fiance. I don't know, because we're not going to be fiancés forever, I guess. Anyways, what I offer to this course is kind of so while Dave will be tackling more of the theory and philosophy, I'll be tackling more of the social science and practical application side of this course, because we feel that with something like digital literacy and critical media theory that is very, very relevant to our everyday lives, we need to give people something to walk away with, something to apply to their lives that is based in the values and the understanding of the theory, but then has that practical application. So I've been, preparing and reading books such as Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman, which relies heavily on McLuhan, as well as books like Reclaiming Conversation by Sherry Turkle and Digital Minimalism by Cal Newport, all of which kind of offer some everyday things that you can implement into your life. And so that is kind of what I bring. I also think I'm bringing this perspective of someone who is a bit younger, part of Gen Z, who grew up from, the age of 10, 11 with Instagram, with an iPad accessible to me at all hours of the day. My parents, none of our parents could have known. We were really the first group of young children to have this stuff in our bedrooms, in our hands. And so I just have this perspective and have kind of struggled with this relationship my whole life. And so I'm excited to explore that with Dave and get some of this theoretical basis that I think is necessary for this conversation.
Thank you. Yes. And I guess, I am Ann's current fiance. My name is David McKerracher. I'm the founder of Theory Underground. And I guess I'll say two things. First, about Theory Underground, that it is a lecture course gated social media site and publishing house by and for working class intellectuals, autodidacts, and renegade academics, or what we call PMCs. And the reason we're current fiancés is because we're really coming up on the wedding date quickly. So we just moved back from Mexico, where we've been for the last 5 months. And now it's just like we've got we've got multiple weddings from of friends and family to attend in different states, and then we go to our own. And so everything's weddings right now. But on the Theory Underground side, I've got the Being in Time research cohort getting ready to get going right now. So I'm doing pre-course lectures on that. And the digital literacy and critical media theory thing is really for our own sanity's sake. And when I say our, I do mean myself and Anne, but also other people who might feel like they've got some sanity to try to either maintain or reclaim, right? And so we're all saturated in new forms of media, and we don't know what the implications, ramifications, or effects of that really might mean just yet, right? This is one of the things that McLuhan is keen on, is that you don't know until afterwards, right? Like the people who were living in the midst of the Gutenberg revolution, they probably didn't think that Martin Luther and Protestantism would have been impossible without that revolution in printing, right? But the written word has always had a profound impact on societies that adopted or discovered it. And one of the things McLuhan talks about in that interview that we've all read, which is the one that Cadell had referenced, it's this fantastic interview that he does with Playboy actually in 1969, which is kind of ironic. He talks about how the phonetic alphabet itself is a form of, it's a kind of medium that fundamentally alters the perception and ability to interpret and experience reality. And so the phonetic alphabet is itself this innovation. Then the printing press is obviously another profound innovation. And so that's what he means by media, right? When he's talking about media, he's talking about any technology that extends any of our senses. And so it's like we are hooked in through our central nervous system into apparatuses of various forms of media or mediums. I like to say mediums because it gets away from the idea of like news media, right? It's grammatically incorrect, but the point is like it's the plural form. Media is supposed to be the plural form of medium, but because media tends to just mean the news, I just say mediums because it's like, okay, there's different kinds of mediums. The pen and the paper, this is a medium for communicating, right? But so is the radio, so is the television, obviously, so is every one of the platforms and websites and various kinds of things that we find ourselves hooked into through screens. And so there's a variety of implications and effects, and we're going to try to figure out what those are, because in the same way that we might not have known, people at the time of Martin Luther might not have realized what they were in the midst of with the rise of nationalism, which was predicated on print, on the distribution of newspapers, really. We don't know what we're in the midst of now. And so we feel that, though, at like this deep visceral level, we feel it. And so I kind of want to turn it back over to Anne to talk a little bit more about the idea that we're trying to salvage or maintain our sanity. Like, what does this course have to do with trying to salvage or maintain our sanity? What is it that we're kind of responding to at the level of how we feel about these mediums that we're using?
Yeah, I think most of us can recognize that there is some sort of negative impact of, social media, the hyper politicized and polarized news media, having our iPhones and Facebook and TikTok and all of these things. I think we can all kind of like, we inherently just feel like, oh, this isn't right. I feel bad when I sit and scroll for hours, even just the physical negative outcomes of that, the eye strain, the headaches when you have to sit on your computer and work all day, like the physical pain that comes from that. And so we all kind of have, I think, somewhat of an awareness that this isn't maybe how humans are supposed to be living our lives, but as McLuhan says, since everything's happening so fast, and at the time that he, was doing this interview back in the 60s, in the late 60s, things were going fast. Well, today it seems like everything has accelerated even more since when he was writing and talking about all of this. And so, with that, I think we really want to slow down with the way that we're running this course, and we want to analyze the values of kind of what it means to be human, really understand how exactly this media works, because it's not enough to just say, oh, well, we kind of know that it's bad. Like, we want to understand why this is bad, what this is doing to us as human beings, how it's affecting our relationships with others, our relationship with ourselves, our mental health, our physical health, all of these things that I think we're almost there. We're almost there, but there's a reason that no one's made any sort of real change. There hasn't been any real changes pushed in the government in the United States to kind of regulate this stuff. People try and try. Oh, I'm gonna break this addiction. I'm gonna change my life. I've tried for the last 10 years. Okay, this week I'm never gonna use social media again. And that's been going on like every month. I'm like, I'm gonna do it. And so we need, I think, that foundation that comes from theory and philosophy to understand our lives with the technology and the media, and then understand our lives without it, and how we can find sort of a happy medium. But how we can live with it and use it to help our lives without, taking complete control, which, we're kind of, you can get into like all the conspiracy theories about, oh, China gave us TikTok to brainwash us, whatever. But I think we do have, as humans, as much as it feels like, oh, it's an addiction, I can never get away from it, I need it for my work, for my social life, we have some control and some power over how and when we use these media. So.
Yeah, no, fantastic. And I like the perspective you bring in, and I think it is valuable for anyone who is going to take the course to know that there is someone in Gen Z who does offer a different perspective. I think Dave and I are probably classified as millennials, and I think I still remember, I think I was in kindergarten when I got my first video game system. I think I was maybe a teenager. Yeah, like maybe borderline teenager when I got the first computer. And I'd imagine that has an impact, not only the fact that the age in which we come into contact with these machines, but also the quality of the machines themselves and the amount of content available, like, the internet before social media versus, like, for example, I think I got Facebook when I was in college, right? So I didn't have social media in high school. And I'd imagine being immersed in social media while you're going through school at that age is a totally different experience and a totally disorienting experience. And I have to say that as it relates to like sort of the stuff Dave and I are doing with, the online education platforms, we have no idea what's going on, really. I mean, we're just sort of freestyling and going along the way. But we don't know the consequences of these mediums. We're sort of caught up in this storm of I guess what McLuhan would call electronic apparatuses. And I don't think anyone would be outraged by some of the claims that McLuhan made in regards to basically the theory of media having a huge impact on our psychologies. But, one of the strange things, when we get into this article of Marshall McLuhan's interview from 1969, I mean, basically his major basic thesis is that all media in and of themselves, and regardless of the messages they communicate, exert a compelling influence on man and society. And it's like, who doesn't believe that now? Like, and at the same time in the interview, they're saying that the old guard humanists and outraged scholars were really upset at McLuhan's basic thesis. So, where do you think, we should be situating McLuhan in regards to modern media ecology? And why do you think there was such a dramatic resistance to these ideas when McLuhan came out? Maybe start with you there, Dave.
Yeah, that's, it's interesting because I think that there was even tremendous pushback against these kinds of claims, even just 7 years ago. I was giving lectures on the impact of technology and media, and I wasn't doing it from a McLuhanite basis just yet. I was drawing from Kierkegaard and Heidegger and some popular books about technology, such as Sherry Turkle's Reclaiming Conversation, and really just my own experience, because coming from a homeschool background, I've always felt like, well, the things that everyone else kind of takes for granted about how social things work, those don't just come naturally. Those don't just make sense. And I know a lot of other homeschoolers, and a lot of them kind of just don't try too hard to learn how to socialize with different kinds of people from different kinds of backgrounds. I've always tried to understand where people are coming from. And so, but one of the things that this kind of background gives me, I think, is some kind of like outsider insight into the culture that I'm in. And one of the things that I saw was texting, going from phone calls to texting to social media, right? Like that was a very, very interesting movement to experience, right? Because there was just a time when it was just all phone calls, right? I guess there was also like AOL Messenger and stuff like that for some people, but then all of a sudden everybody's texting, right? And most of that's being done on those old keyboards, right? Or those old, just like the phone number pad. And then the shift to smartphones happens like over the course of like 5 or 6 years, and people changed. And I could see that people changed, but it didn't seem like people were aware that they had changed. And so that's what kind of got me interested in philosophy of technology. So then when I went to college and I was studying philosophy, I was like, oh, I love this stuff. I love this philosophy stuff. I wonder if it has anything to say about technology. So I start looking into it there. And I start thinking about the public, or how Heidegger talks about das Man. And I start thinking about how the dynamics of, well, like, so with das Man, for instance, there's this tendency for 3 factors to cause like this downward pulling motion that makes everything more superficial, just in general conversation. And that is superficially detached curiosity, right? It's non-committal curiosity. It's just kind of like, oh, what's that? Passing interests. It just wants to be, it wants to be entertained, but it doesn't want to commit and go in depth, right? So that's curiosity in that sense, combined with speaking in ambiguous terms, right? Throwing around words, but not unpacking their meanings. And then the other one is chit chat, like idle chatter, kind of just bullshitting, or a bull session. It's kind of like what guys do when they're at the pub or whatever. It's like a bull session. It's like, it's just kind of, you're shooting the shit, which is okay. And of course, people do this in a lot of different ways, but there's a problem when those 3 things are all operating and you take that for granted as like, well, that's the human experience. That's just how we communicate. That's just what we are. And it's like, no, that's not just what we are. That is like base camp. And we can scale the heights to have more genuine conversations, to get more in-depth and intimate understandings of the subject matters or of the other people in the conversation. And so the thing is like that interplay of those 3 factors, ambiguity, idle chatter, and curiosity, pulling us downwards, obviously that's accelerated and normalized in a crazy way by something like Facebook or MySpace before it, or Twitter now, or TikTok, of course. And so which is obviously TikTok's like the fastest version of all of those. And so this was already something I was talking about. I didn't have the McLuhanite basis. And so this is why before we started recording this, I was talking about how critical media theory can't really get underway properly without a basis in McLuhan, because he's the father of media theory itself. And as the father of media theory, he's the one who really just drives home this point that these aren't just interfaces that we use. This isn't just something that mediates perception. It's not just something that makes present something far away. That's all interesting as well. But the most important thing is that it's an actual extension of us. He calls it the extensions of man, right? And to think about writing as an extension of man, to think about all of these as basically like expansion packs added to the game of what it means to be a human. It's interesting. And my position has never been one of that's purely pessimistic or negative, but I do take the critical standpoint primarily, and I think for the most part, just because other people don't want to think about the negative implications, right? Now, that's kind of changing. And in the last 5 years especially, it's become quite common to hear people talk about algorithmic the algorithmic selection effect, the siloing, the echo chambers, the people will say things like tribalism or in groups or out groups, but various kinds of otherization that occur on that basis. And so people are kind of figuring out that there's something going on there, to the point where now if I say that this stuff has this big impact on us, like you're all saying, we're not going to get pushback the same way that we used to. But at conferences like 7 years ago, I would talk about this and people seemed unable to even process. And now maybe this was the fault of my communication style, but they actually seemed unable to tarry with the negative, to really think about the negative implications, because they were so invested in being for technological progress and being for social media. And a lot of it's because academics are baby boomers in these kind of conference environments that I was in. And a lot of baby boomers around that time, 7 to 10 years ago, had only recently started using social media. And late adopters to social media tend to be its most sort of uncritical supporters, just in my experience. I've got no data to back this up beyond my own experience. And so, take it with a grain of salt, but I seem to have noticed like this shift from late adopters being uncritically supportive to then being, oh, it's bad and I'm addicted to it and it sucks and it's ruining our relationships, but at least I get to see my grandkids. So here I am, I'm still here, which means that the shift happened from going from optimist to pessimist. But one of the things that I'm going to be talking about throughout this course is that this is a false binary. That the division between optimism and pessimism is a division between moods, right? Which moods reveal things, right? Like they definitely show us stuff, but technology is neither optimistic or pessimistic. We don't have to choose a side in this binary. We have to understand it though, right? Because insofar as there are good things, we're not going to be able to get those good things or take advantage of them if we don't think about media critically. And insofar as there are negative things, if we're not thinking about media critically, we don't realize how those patterns are playing themselves out on us, reshaping us, reprogramming us at the most intimate level. So that's why critical media theory has to be the basis for digital literacy.
Yeah. And I think McLuhan in the interview has kind of a similar idea in terms of it's not all negative. I think the interviewer at one point even asked in relation to the telegraph. So are you saying that the invention of the telegraph like really just was bad overall, a net negative for humanity? And he said, well, no, of course it's not just net negative and there are positives that come from it, but we have to kind of critically understand those negatives. And I think that, you had asked, how do we situate McLuhan in the current conversation? And we can sit here and we can critique TikTok, Facebook, the news, all of this technology on its own. But I think something that McLuhan does that is so essential to this conversation is he theorizes about and explores, as he calls it. He calls himself, right, an explorer in this field. humanity in relation, humans in relation to this technology. We're not just looking at us and then the technology. It is the interplay between us, the relationship that we have with the technology, that the technology has with us. And I think that is just so foundational to this conversation because as we can get to, and as he gets to in the interview, it is an extension of ourselves. It radically changes how we structure our lives, our values as a society, as a culture. And so we have to understand he's theorizing about humanity just as much as the technology, not just the technology.
All right, fantastic. I mean, I just want to start off with sort of bringing us back to, I think, an important observation Dave made as an example of that transition that occurred maybe even before, you were even aware of it, and between phone calls, texting, and social media. Because I still remember when I was a kid, it was all phone calls. Even like I remember as a kid, it was going around and knocking on each other's doors. Like that's old school.
No, it's actually kind of like, it's considered like, some people, if you do that now, they'd be like,
oh no, that's a big no-no. Yeah. That would be seen as insane. Like there's this guy who keeps on knocking on our door. Like, but no, like when we were kids, like back when I was a boy, we would like literally go door to door. Like we would say, like, let's go call on people. And by let's go call on people, we would mean let's go knock and see if Jimmy's home. Right. And let's see if he's up to go play hide and seek or whatever. Like that would be perceived as a huge rule violation or an unspoken implicit rule violation if you were to do that today. And it's just so strange today because a lot of the friends I have, I mean, are, I don't know, in Mexico, for example, right? Like, right. And like, let's go call on Dave, right? Is a Zoom call, right? Like, and so this is in some sense, it's a very practical example where you can see our senses literally becoming extended towards not just our immediate body, but around the globe. And so now you have all human beings who are not just sensory limited to a sort of sensory sphere, which is very close to the tribe and very close to the body, but where the body and the tribe has become planetary. And the body and the tribe has become truly global in scope, and time and space become less relevant in some sense. And so this is incredibly disorienting, and this is incredibly transformative, and creates all sorts of weird dynamics that probably we have no capacity to really think about. So when you think about some of the foundations of McLuhan's ideas, like there are some of the common statements like the medium is the message, some other ideas like this, or how do you think he gives us the tools to engage with new critical media theory? Like you're saying, we need a foundation in McLuhan before we can even engage in critical media theory and digital literacy today.
I think that's the perfect jumping off point actually to the difference between critical media theory and media theory in this McLuhanite sense. He kind of was back and forth between optimism and sort of pessimism, but he never had a critique of capital, right? He considered him, I mean, if you read Understanding Media, pretty early into the book, he actually says that what he is seeing in media proves Marx wrong in terms of the priority of base over superstructure, right? So basically, for people who don't get the jargon there, the base is the productive manufacturing base of society, right? Where everything comes from, as opposed to the superstructure, which is the culture, right? Well, the priority of base over superstructure in traditional worldview Marxism is to say we shouldn't focus on cultural things. We shouldn't. Yes, we use the newspaper, we use the written word in the printing press to distribute propaganda, but the propaganda always is supposed to be drawing people's attention back to the productive base and the relations of production that set up society in a class formation, right? And so the goal is obviously being to raise workers' consciousness of their oppression so that they will organize for the revolution. Okay, well, the problem with this, McLuhan says, is that media, it's not just like a vehicle for words that are purely ideological, right? It's actually something that fundamentally transforms our very subjectivity itself, right? And so what he says is that with digitalization, there's been a reversal of priority, so that there is now superstructure is over determining the base in this like reversal. And I admit to not being an expert on McLuhan. To me, there's a big question as far as like how far he actually takes his engagement with Marx. And until I've read everything he's written multiple times, who knows? But for now, I can say that in multiple places, I have seen him saying this thing about Marx, and it makes it seem like Marx was completely unaware of how much we are impacted by technology. I think Marx would probably just agree with McLuhan, at least as far as like the understanding that in human nature, insofar as we have a nature, is the augmentation of our nature through technological means. And I think that both of them see that. So getting the two of them to talk to one another is really important to me. But all of this I just said as like a sort of to lay the groundwork to just say there's a sort of missed opportunity between the critique of political economy from Marx and McLuhan's media theory, that this critique from the McLuhan position of worldview Marxism, it's interesting, but worldview Marxism for me, it's already, we don't have to take it very seriously, right? It's like a 100-year-old, 150-year-old response to a very specific situation that was trying to organize an actual working class that was aware of itself, like the industrial proletariat that had not been fragmented yet. And this was all prior to the emergence and construction of the professional managerial class. So it's a different situation. It's interesting historically, but the most important thing from Marx is his critique of political economy. And I just don't know that McLuhan had actually read Capital, right? Much less like the 1844 manuscripts. So from my position as a sort of post-Marxist, I'm profoundly impacted by Marx. I want to get McLuhan and Marx to talk. Now, the problem with not having a critique of capitalism, much less like a real critique of power from the McLuhan position, it's not that much of a problem for what he's doing, but it's a problem for what we're doing, or at least what I'm doing. And so, this idea of the global village being like one of the positive aspects of what's coming out of these developments with digitalization, it's hard for me to look at it and take it very seriously, because nothing shows us that there's an actual global village occurring. Like we could say there's a billion villages occurring, but that's a billion villages. That's not a village, right? This idea that we all start to find our common humanity through the internet, I don't think so. I think that we all start to find ourselves as belonging to micro niche boutique consumer identities, right? And that's actually what we're all doing here with philosophy and theory. It's a boutique consumer identity on the internet. Obviously, we hope that it's more than just that. Obviously, we hope that we're doing so much more than just that. And we're trying to actually engage with the world in some more rigorous way that doesn't just repeat what happens with the insularity of academia. But I guess that's just my main point, is that the way that power has played out and the way that capitalism works on the internet is not to make it so that we're all this part of this big collective now. No, it's we're becoming increasingly hyper niche boutique consumer identities. So I wonder though, how your work on the global brain has developed in with McLuhan, or like how you've thought with McLuhan. I know you've kind of referenced that before, and so I wonder if you could say something about that, Cadell. Like, is this something that you're picking up on, or do you have a different angle on it?
No, yeah, I can jump in here. So one of the weird things in my reading of this paper on McLuhan is that he has this hypothesis that it's the phonetic alphabet, writing basically, which takes us away from our senses. And he has, in my view, a structure, a metaphysical structure as a consequence of this, which reminds me a lot of Marxism in the sense of the original primitive communism, where we were one with our senses, we were one with our nature, and then we fell into history. We fell into different in Marxist terms, we fell into different modes of I guess slavery and exploitation and feudal society. In McLuhan's terms, we fell into an outsized impact of vision and writing and literacy. And then they both have this same idea that we're going back towards some global harmony, which will re-establish the original primitive condition. So like Marx would have the idea that world communism is re-establishing on a global level primitive communism. And McLuhan has this idea that the global village is somehow re-establishing the original tribal nature that we had before falling into history. So that structure is very similar, and I'm skeptical of both structures precisely because I feel like the asymmetry didn't happen in history with writing, but the asymmetry happened with the emergence of language as such. So it's not just that writing the phonetic alphabet creates this gap or creates this asymmetry, this discord in ourselves, but language as such, the signifier as such, creates the discord and disrupts our senses primordially. And as a consequence of that, we should be very careful of falling into this narrative teleology where we're heading towards some global harmony. I don't like this idea of heading towards some global harmony. I think what we're doing is we're heading towards some imminent global antagonism. And I think that's, like, for example, the idea of the global village, it's I would say it's more like, I don't know what, like we're heading into, well, also in regards to the idea of a global village is like in primitive communism, so to speak, in hunter-gatherer society, conflict was actually quite high. It was different, but conflict was high. I mean, I would imagine in a global village, what we're going to see is all new forms of competition. And I think that's indeed what we are seeing in regards to like just what you were saying about our activity here, Dave, in regards to like Theory Underground, Philosophy Portal, where you're going to see all sorts of new types of digital competition in establishing a new world. And the question is, how do we establish networks of cooperation in this landscape? Because it's very difficult, because we're very pulled away from our bodies. We haven't had physical interaction. And as a consequence of that, basically there's this play of virtual identities, which can become very, in some sense, pathological, especially without a critique of capital and without a critique of power. So I'm glad that you're bringing that angle to McLuhan, because I think that is an angle that is missing. There is a type of utopianization of the electronic media. And even in this article, he says, almost like this desire to exist in a medium beyond language, or like with no language, like he says that in this. So I guess, I don't know if that answers your question, but I do see both if I could bring it into a summary, I would say both the ideas of world communism and the ideas of the global village to me, repeat an ideological structure, which we should be deeply critical of on the level of this idea of a holistic harmony, which eliminates antagonism. And I think that what's at the heart of it is the origin of language and the way in which the discord or the antagonism is at the heart of our being in language. And the task of thought is to think with language as opposed to thinking out of language, right? To try to get out of it in some way. So I'll throw that back to you, and then we'll get Anne's perspective on this.
Yeah, I was thinking I'm going to just set Anne up here to talk about what she understands digital literacy to be as opposed to how it's typically taught. But to set her up, I wanted to read a quote because I do try to read at least one or two quotes every live stream in the last, this is a more recent thing, but I'm just trying to be a little bit more textual and to allow the voice of the person that we're talking about to kind of come through. And as I said yesterday, like even when it's translated from German into English, the voice, something about that voice still carries through. But the nice thing about McLuhan is actually he's writing in English, and so you get it straight here, folks. He's a Canadian, actually. He's like the one philosopher from Canada, which is, fantastic. Maybe that's not fair. There's a lot of philosophers in Canada, but he's the one that Canada's like most well known for. And so I want to see, I've got two quotes here. Yeah, this is the one. In the past, the effects of media were experienced more gradually, allowing the individual and society to absorb and cushion their impact to some degree. Today, in the electronic age of instantaneous communication, I believe that our survival, and at the very least, our comfort and happiness, is predicated on understanding the nature of our new environment, because unlike previous environmental changes, the electric media constitute a total and near instantaneous transformation of culture, values, and attitudes. So he's saying the very possibility of being optimistic depends on our ability to educate ourselves about these things that we're using. He goes on, this upheaval generates great pain and identity loss, which can be ameliorated only through a conscious awareness of its dynamics. If we understand the revolutionary transformations caused by new media, we can anticipate and control them. But if we continue in our self-induced subliminal trance, we will be their slaves. I'm going to actually keep going here because there's like this is actually from a little bit later in the text, but this is absolutely crucial because we're getting into the idea of the need to understand these transformations and how we're going to be slaves if we cannot do that. Then he says, because of today's terrific speed up of information moving, we have a chance to apprehend, predict, and influence the environmental forces shaping us, and thus win back control of our own destinies. The new extensions of man and the environment they generate are the central manifestations of the evolutionary process, and yet we still cannot free ourselves of the delusion that it is how a medium is used that counts, rather than what it does to us and with us. This is the zombie stance of the technological idiot. It's to escape this narcissist's trance that I've tried to trace and reveal the impact of media on man from the beginning of recorded time to the present. And so, in a sense, I think we do take this that he's saying very seriously, and it's something we're trying to practice in our own lives. And so I think that that's a nice tie-in to how Anne is conceptualizing digital literacy. Would you agree, Anne?
Yeah, I think so. And so I want to, before talking about digital literacy, I want to provide the Google definition of literacy, which is the ability to read and write. So under that definition, pretty much anyone over the age of 5 is literate, can read and write. But Dave has offered this definition, or kind of changed the definition of literacy by adding the word functional. Are you functionally literate? So Dave would argue that a lot of people in our society today are functionally illiterate in the sense that, yes, they can read and write for their jobs, they can read the newspaper, they can watch the newspaper, but functionally illiterate in the sense that they can't pick up a hard book and really struggle with it and tarry with it and focus on it. And so in the same vein, the Wikipedia definition of digital literacy is an individual's ability to find, evaluate, and communicate information by utilizing typing or digital media platforms. So under that definition, both of my grandmas are digitally literate in the sense that they know how to text and they know how to, use Google Pictures and whatnot. But in the same way that we're not really considering someone to be totally literate if they can't really struggle with and understand text, we want to work with a new definition of digital literacy in the sense that it's not just being able to use the technology, but it's being able to understand the digital technology, critically understand it, how it affects our lives, how to use it in a beneficial way, how to avoid using it in negative ways. So that's kind of this distinction that I think people think digital literacy, like when in school, for example, in high school, we were all required to take some sort of class that was like kind of getting the basics of like Microsoft and Word. And it is kind of thought of as, a digital literacy class. You're learning how to be literate in this stuff, but it's just very surface level. You know how to use it. I've never been given a class on, using technology that actually goes into the philosophy of the technology or really makes you think about why we're using this technology, how we, used to go about, in the instance of Excel or Word, how we used to go about typing information and organizing information into spreadsheets. We never have this greater understanding of our historical relationship to what we're doing, and then in relation to other modes of technology, other mediums. And so that's what we want to focus on in this class, is not just, do you know how to use it, but do you understand why you're using it and how you're using it? I also want to really quick go back to this conversation about kind of the global community that is brought about by this technology, because something that Neil Postman offers in this discourse that I think is really interesting is he talks about this difference between, where people's focus was in the age of typography and the age of, like literacy, and where everyone especially he's mostly focusing on the United States during like the 17th through the 19th centuries. But there was a time in the age of typography, the typographic man, where everyone knew how to read. Everyone was reading books, the pamphlets, the newspapers. Everyone was kind of following the local discourse. And so everyone had this deep, rich understanding of what was going on nationally, sometimes, especially in the case of like the Lincoln Douglas debates, where they were going all over the country giving like 3, 4, 5, 6, even 7-hour lectures and debates. And people could follow that. So that was kind of the extent of the national connection and the national discourse that people followed and had a grasp on, but mostly people knew what was going on locally. They were very locally connected. Everyone had this basis in the text, in the news was relevant. Whereas with the introduction of the telegraph, now all of a sudden someone in Maine could communicate with someone in Texas, and Postman, posits the question of, well, why do people in Maine and Texas really need to communicate with each other? Why does someone in Texas need to know about the shooting that happened in Maine or the robbery that happened in North Carolina? And I think that kind of just gets to what you two were both talking about is, yeah, we know what's going on locally or globally, but what can we actually do about it? Is there a benefit to having all this knowledge? And today, I think it's even more exacerbated than when Postman and McLuhan were writing, in the sense that you can get on TikTok and see 10 different global issues going on at the same time, but we actually can't do anything about it. And Postman talks about this, how what did he call it? The information action ratio, I think is what he called it, changed with the introduction of the telegraph. So we used to be able to, back before the telegraph, when everything was kind of in local newspapers, we'd get a piece of information and we could take immediate action. Oh, there was this, earthquake or something that happened right here on this street, or this building is being torn down. I'm going to avoid that street. Whereas, oh, this thing is happening in Maine, this thing is happening in the UK, this thing is happening in Australia. Okay, that doesn't change anything radical about my day. And so I just think that was like kind of an interesting contribution to this is, yeah, and then how is that shaping us in our psyches? And I almost, when I was reading this, I was thinking it almost makes us like apathetic to any sort of action because we're so used to reading news that we can't do anything about. And that obviously goes into critiques of like hegemony, ideology, capitalism, all of that goes into play with our ability to feel like we can make social change. But then when we're being bombarded with news that, yeah, I guess it's good to be a globally connected citizen and know what's going on. But at what point is it too much? At what point are we just overwhelmed with information to where we can't even focus on or comprehend or feel any sort of empathy towards local situations and then solve those? It's like just in Reno, I was driving down the street the other day and it was like riddled with potholes. And I'm like, that feels like an important issue that we could all as a community like rally behind, like let's clear the potholes in our community. But no one's writing newspaper articles about that. It's, oh, Biden this, oh, Ukraine war that. Okay, maybe that's useful, maybe that's important, but I, as someone living in Reno, Nevada, or in Mexico, can't really help that.
A fantastic point, Anne, and I just want to sort of say that, one of the craziest things about, the internet and our communication mediums is that it takes us from, to me, it's like this collision between our evolutionary drives and the global digital, where we are evolutionarily wired and programmed for, discerning relevance within a tribe of 200 people, right? So, hey, our tribe has a problem with the proverbial potholes, right? Like, but when our tribe becomes all of a sudden in the span of like 2 decades, when our tribe becomes 7 billion, 8 billion people, the problem of relevance, the problem of what to pay attention to and why, all of a sudden becomes overwhelming. And I remember, for example, back in 2016, I was actually happened to be on a trip in Israel, and I found myself waking up in my apartment or my Airbnb upset that Trump was elected. And I was just like, what am I doing? Like, why do I care about this right now? Like, it's just this, this parasitical grasp of the global digital communication system, which is totally disorienting and pulling me away from the immediacy of where I am and what I'm doing and what I should be paying attention to. And I think for me in that context, McLuhan is at his best when he says something like, man is caused by a new medium, and the medium, like the electronic media, is like an atomic bomb. And I think that this is, to me, how we should conceive of the global village. It's like the internet is like an atomic bomb, and an atomic bomb that totally disorients all of our senses of being here, being in the world. And in that sense, I just throw out the question of what comes to your mind when you think about, our current media in that context of like a global bomb has gone off. And now we're just trying to piece together a sense of what the world might look like after the bomb's gone off,
I'm going to just jump right in then to say that, like, I think the tie between, and maybe I'm setting you up, Anne, but the tie between digital literacy and the detonation of this bomb is, well, two things. I think we need to focus on survival itself, right? The maintenance and salvaging of sanity, right? Like McLuhan actually says that he thinks one of the consequences of, I kept saying digitalization, but that's actually not the word that he was using here. And I don't think he was so much observing digitalization as what was the word he was just using in that quote? It's the electronic age of instantaneous communication, right? That's what he's focusing on, is this. He says that humans did not evolve to communicate or perceive things that aren't present to us, like in our vicinity, at the speed of light, right? So at the time of the founding of the United States, it took like the shortest amount of time it would take to send a letter to somebody in Paris was like 7 months, right? Like, if you read the letter exchanges between, like, say, John Adams and Abigail Adams, sometimes it took like 1.5 years because one of those ships sank, right? Like, there's just this like communication. We had so much time to cool down after receiving a letter. Like, you've already been processing all this stuff you want to say, and then you read this letter like 8 times over the course of a few days while you're kind of thinking out what you want to say in response, and then you pen this beautiful letter and then you send that back, and it's like that is not here, that is not with us, that is gone, right? Like, instead you get people apologizing because they didn't respond instantaneously. Oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't respond at the speed of light exactly when you wanted me to. What? And so I put out a video at the beginning of this year that was just like, don't ever apologize to me for not responding quickly, because that normalizes this idea of instantaneity, of instantaneous access to the other. I am not available on demand at the speed of light, and neither should you. And we should not expect one another to be. But there is this expectation. And obviously that is an expectation that doesn't serve us. It serves our bosses, who want to be able to reach us on the like a Friday evening to say, I actually want you to come in on Saturday morning, right? It works in the interest of companies, the most profitable companies in the world, where data is more valuable than oil. And data is really just what? Mass eyeballs, right? Mass eyeballs peeking in at the phone while on the toilet, while at the dinner table, while on a walk with friends, family, or by oneself, right? Interfering with that space of solitude. And so it's beneficial to big capital. It's beneficial to the Silicon Valley technicians who make this stuff as addicting as possible and then outlaw it in their own private elite schools because they know it would harm their children. Yet they're spreading it across the entire country to everybody else's children, right? That's criminal. But it's going to be a long time before we see anything come about to actually do anything about it. So that's why for right now, it's about survival and the maintenance of our sanity, or that's trying to salvage our sanity in some cases. And so I guess on the one side, it's survival. On the other side, it's etiquette. We don't have etiquette anymore. Like in the Victorian era, etiquette had become so exaggerated and hyperbolic because of class, with the Victorian aristocracy trying to set itself apart in distinction from lower classes, to where, you know, you have like 156 different kinds of forks and spoons and knives just to eat, you know, different kinds of meals and stuff. I'm exaggerating, but it's quite the elaborate setup. Well, at least they had an etiquette though, and we lack etiquette altogether. For instance, if somebody says, I'm so sorry for not responding sooner, or if I haven't responded in a day's time, and then they're like, are you there? Have I offended you? This is the result of the neuroses caused by rapid evolutionary changes in our mode of life that etiquette hasn't kept up with, that ethics hasn't caught up with. And so when we try to use old forms of etiquette or old forms of ethics, old kinds of expectations in this new context, maybe they're antiquated, maybe they don't actually make sense anymore. But we're trying to hold on to something because we want there to be a way that we're supposed to go about things, because otherwise it's so confusing. So the lack of etiquette, ethics, and expectations has caused a lot of people to want to grasp onto older ideas. And then the people who are like, well, those are just antiquated, those people are not developing realistic, plausible forms of etiquette that could be used by a society at large. Instead, they're extremely hyper niche. So for instance, like leftist social justice, we're going to try to spot microaggressions. We're going to look at who talks for how long and be like a little accountants over who says how many words and what kinds of identity is that person holding and how well are they representing that group. And, and then judging people as individuals on the basis of like how well they are basically acting as influencers instead of treating them like singular humans. And so that's this stuff that comes out of little folk political groups trying to maintain their own sanity and live counter to a mass society that has lost any kind of sense of etiquette. Obviously, these kinds of spaces want to change the Overton window. They want to change what's normal, and they want to try to impact the society at large. But because they're so niche in the curation of their boutique consumer identities, right? Their solutions aren't really intelligible, palpable, or reasonable for most people. And so what I'm saying is that we lack general consensus about how we should be people with one another socially. And so I'm not saying that we're going to develop our own, mass appeal kind of etiquette at Theory Underground, but we're going to be thinking in that direction a little bit, and at least for ourselves, like survival and like how do we set expectations and boundaries with other people who've been habituated towards this stuff. And I think digital literacy on the base with a foundation of critical media theory, these are the prerequisites for what we need if we are to survive as humans, which is ultimately a new form of like a way of being with one another. And we're not going to come up with that without these things.
Yeah. And so, kind of going off of that and thinking about the like atomic bomb that I see, one that really deeply concerns me and is something that I want to focus on, and then that I just have experience with being someone who is from Gen Z. I see, Twitter, but mostly Instagram and TikTok as these like radically new atomic bomb that has completely shaped and changed, people from as young as 9 years old to people my age and a little bit older, in their 20s. So elementary school to like college age young professionals. And I think there's enough critique right now on what the content of this media does to us, how it, shapes our perception of gender and our bodies and all of that. But I really am looking forward to kind of exploring these new forms of social media that are so popular, especially with young people right now, as the media in themselves, and how the form of these are radically changing us. So with TikTok especially, like most of my peers, I haven't been on TikTok for a couple of years. It really got popular at the peak of the pandemic. We were all lonely. Everyone was like, oh, I'm gonna, learn TikTok dances and make bread and whipped coffee. And that was kind of the thing that was bringing us together. But I see it as just this very, very dangerous technology that has radically shaped, and not only TikTok, but like Instagram and the technologies that I had when I was, 11, 12 years old have completely changed this generation's attention span. I mean, that's a struggle that educators are having to deal with a lot right now, is how to hold students' attention. When I was working in the university trying to develop a course, I even struggled just to convince the other professor to give the students longer readings. It's like even college age students in college setting courses, they're just not expected to read anything long. And you can be, frustrated about it from a teaching perspective, but you can't blame them, because they go home and it's, oh, TikTok. Okay, I switched to this. Oh, okay, switch to this. Oh, I'm looking at this now. Oh, I'm on my laptop. It's like there's this current meme going around right now that's how to get kids to focus. And it has someone's like giving a speech, and then on the screen next to them is the game Subway Surfers. They're just like playing a video loop of Subway Surfers. And that's kind of the meme, is like young people today have to have something else to focus on along with the speech or along with whoever's talking. Like, we can't just sit and read a book for an hour or 2 hours. It's like go, 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 go. And so that's a struggle that teachers are having to deal with. We see, this technology that we're always on. It's in when we're standing in lines, we can no longer just kind of stand in a line in an elevator, at the dinner table. That I tell Dave, that is my, like, the thing that makes me the most sad about all of this technology, and I think is really telling of our times, is when we're out at a restaurant and I see a family sitting together and the parents are both on their phone and the kid is like watching something on an iPad or their parents' phone. No more is it, oh, let's play tic-tac-toe on the kids menu and talk about our weeks. So it's radically changing the family. It's radically changing friendships. The way I communicate with some of my friends now who are from high school, who I don't see very much, is rather than checking in on each other, we send each other memes and we send each other TikToks. And that's kind of our monthly or bi-monthly like check-in. And so it's radically changing us in all of these ways. Sherry Turkle, when we in the course, we'll talk about these two concepts that she focuses on, solitude versus solicitude. It changed. So solitude being our time with ourselves. This technology has radically changed our ability to have any sort of solitude at all. I mean, I'm guilty of it as well. Just sitting with myself and having nothing coming into my brain, just me and my own thoughts. I think today, we consider me time solitude as sitting and having your phone or getting to watch Netflix or watch some YouTube videos. And then on the other hand, solicitude being with others, that's been radically changed as well, because like I said, we always have the phone with us. We're, switching attention between the person that we're with and what's on the screen, and engaging with them by look at what's on my screen. And so in terms of thinking about how to deal with this atomic bomb of this technology that has like rapidly changed our attention span and kind of how we interact with ourselves and each other, I falter between being an optimist and a pessimist. Like every other week, it seems like I go, oh, it's hopeless, I can't do anything about it. And then, oh no, we can take individual action. And I think after this interview that Dave and I did just last week with Andrew McLuhan, the grandson of Marshall McLuhan, I definitely have a bit of more optimism than I think I normally have, which is, as much as we can blame the system, we can blame the developers of this technology, we can have the critiques of the technology itself, and the apps. We also have the power to, and it's really hard, especially when you know that some of these apps were developed by the people who develop slot machines and who figured out how to make it as addicting as gambling. So it's a struggle, but we have the power to say, no, I'm going to read for 15 minutes straight. And that is a form of resistance of, no, I am going to leave my phone in the other room, or there's a trend where people, like, when they're out to dinner, everyone stacks their phones on top of each other, and the first friend to grab their phone has to pay for the meal. So it's like, that is a form of resistance, is no, we're all going to be present with each other without our phone. And so those individual actions are what I'm excited to focus on and kind of develop with the theoretical basis in this course, but are things that we can do to kind of attempt to get our own individual lives back. It's never going to be perfect. We're never going to be able to escape it completely. Sometimes you need Facebook to, get updates from a group, or to be able to message certain people in another country that you're friends with. So we're never going to escape it, but it is just finding those little changes to make that we can maybe start to resist it and reclaim our lives and realize, oh, there is so much more to life and this world than just what's the latest TikTok trend, what's going on here, what's going on in this political sphere. Dave, you're muted on Zoom.
I mean, Dave, did you want to jump in there? Go for it if you do.
Okay, yeah, I'll just I just kind of want to say that the structure of this course and the intent of the course, beyond the, salvaging our sanity or whatever, is also to kind of take what little of this kind of theory and digital literacy we've already developed. I say little and to be humble, but also just realistic. Like, we're not as studied in this as we want to be. And that's part of the reason that we're doing this. We're calling it a research cohort. It's not just a lecture course. Yes, there will be monthly lecture sessions, but it's also a research cohort. And so the people involved are co-researchers in this process. The stuff that we are going to be lecturing on is the stuff that we're most familiar with. And so there's a lot of important philosophers and technology theorists that we're not going to be going into very in depth. And really, we're not going to be doing anything in depth. And so the point is like, oh, you've got lots of different courses going on, or you've got work and family and life, and you're really busy and you're already super distracted and you're already not very well versed in writing and reading. You've pretty much not done that since high school or college. And you've just been super preoccupied with everything else. And some of the people who are doing this course will be also reading Being in Time with us. And so nobody has the time and energy, but we need to think and be reminded of our relationship with ourselves, with others, and the devices that are mediating or interrupting, but potentially enhancing those relationships in some ways. And so we could have just done this as a short course where we do it in 6 weeks, just a month and a half's time. We could have done it all in that window, but then you would have gotten back to your normal life. And the point is that in a hyper distracted world, something that is meant to counter the most impactful tendencies of the current situation, which is like acceleration and distraction, it has to be broken up. And it has to allow you to get into it and to fall off of it and then get back into it again, right? And so this is really like the most preliminary, most introductory level course to thinking about all of these things. And so for some weeks, like 1 week, we're focusing all on the idea of solitude versus solicitude. Or I'm sorry, 1 month. So 1 month, we're focusing on solitude versus solicitude. Sherry Turkle doesn't call it solicitude. She just talks about genuine being with yourself versus genuinely being with other people, and how when your devices keep interrupting both of those relationships, all that you have is what did she say? Being lonely with oneself and being lonely with other people, right? Hannah Arendt is an important theorist who she's always thinking about the impact of these new developments. And so she's not typically in the canon of philosophy of technology or media theory, but I think she belongs there. Like, her Human Condition is a genuine contribution to all of this. And in her Responsibility and Judgment, there's a couple of amazing essays about solitude as the precondition to having a moral compass, much less to being able to navigate with others ethically, right? So when that relationship between solicitude and solitude is being broken, that's also undermining our abilities to be moral, ethical, judgment-making kinds of creatures, right? So, that's just 1 month. We're going to have a whole month on manufacturing consent and propaganda, because I mean, that's more of how people tend to think of media. When they hear of media and they're thinking about it critically, they're thinking of manufacturing consent with Chomsky. They might be thinking of Edward Bernays' propaganda. They might have. I'm forgetting the name, and this is bad. Who's the Adam Curtis documentaries, right? Like those are very impactful on this discourse in the niche areas of the internet that actually kind of pay attention to these things, to how technology and media have shaped subjectivity. So people watch a lot of Adam Curtis documentaries, and that's definitely like the focus on propaganda and manufacturing consent and the psychology of persuasion. But we're just going to do that in 1 month. Introduce a variety of authors, introduce a variety of concepts, talk about some basic stuff in both propaganda and advertising/marketing, right? Because marketing and propaganda both rely on certain concepts of psychology, and they instrumentalize psychology with the intent of persuasion and manipulation, right? And so on the one level, we want to defend ourselves from that. But also we want to think about that in the context of McLuhan, right? And it's thinking about things critically in the on that sort of McLuhan / Marxist basis that gets us to thinkers like Virilio, that gets us to thinkers like Baudrillard. And so there's a lot of these other thinkers who are going to be absolutely fundamental, but first we have to pass through McLuhan. Then there's Heidegger's The Question Concerning Technology. There's like more recent books like Hate Inc., which is really Hate Inc. is the continuation of the Manufacturing Consent Project, basically showing how we've moved away from the media, the news media model, where everything is about manufacturing consent with like some like majority that the left and the right have a general consensus agreement on like a ton of things, right? And it's the new model is duopoly of constant civil war in the cultural realm, right, between Fox News and MSNBC. And so that, I mean, that's the business model now, is constant antagonism, constant anxiety, constant stress. That's the marketing strategy now, as opposed to in the 1980s and the 1990s. It was more of like, we all, left or right, kind of laugh at the fringe freaks who they're all upset and hysterical, right? Like, oh, it's those the book burners over here, and these abortion protesters over here. Like, we laugh at them, but we have a general consensus, and that kind of keeps the majority together. No, the new model with Hate Inc. is no. Half the country's absolutely crazy and wants to kill us and fuck up your kids, and then the other half is saying no, all the same things, but it's them, and it's constant. And in actual fact, they don't represent halves of the country; they represent like 15% of the country. Each of these sides represents about 15% of the country, and then most other people kind of just have like some vague sense that that's going on, and they hate it and they're averse to it, right? So we move through all of those things. We're going to get into Byung-Chul Han's psychopolitics, his burnout society. And so we're drawing from all of these different theorists. And then we're drawing from, as Anne was saying, the digital literacy people are a lot more like this popular newsstand bestseller types of thinkers like Cal Newport and Sherry Turkle, who are absolutely fundamental, right? Because they're doing work that is not being done in theory circles or in philosophy circles. And so their work in some ways is going to benefit a lot from being brought into dialogue with these theorists, but these theorists are going to benefit as well by being brought into actual practice, right? Into these basic strategies for coping, right? And so every month there will just be a single assignment as far as like what you're supposed to be doing that month. And it might just be to, figure out like to leave your phone downstairs or not to bring it to your bedroom. Your phone, your bedroom becomes a no phone zone, right? Or it could be an assignment like doing a journal entry, even for just 5 minutes per day, right? But these basic kinds of things that are meant to, in various ways, intervene and counteract certain tendencies. And then there's like this discussion group component so that we'll be able to kind of all share our experiences, because that's the idea about this being a research cohort, is that none of us really know the answers. We just don't. And so what we hope to do is find, share, learn, grow together.
Fantastic. I mean, I think a lot of the themes that we're running through both of your reflections there, a lot of them involve boundary formation. Like, so I think, like, for example, if we use the metaphor of the internet and the electronic media as a type of atomic bomb, it's like what the bomb exploded were our boundaries or constraints or sort of simply limits. And so now we live in this space of no boundaries. We live in this space of no constraints. We live in this space of no limits. And we don't have any normativity. We don't have any consensus or center to organize a new set of boundaries, a new set of constraints, a new set of limits. And I think that brings us to an interesting interplay, which I wanted to talk about that's throughout McLuhan's work, which is this idea that the types of media that developed in civilization led to an individualistic culture as opposed to a tribal culture, and that the electronic media is leading us back to a tribal culture and away from an individualistic culture. Again, you get this structure which appears in Marx from primitive communism to world communism, where you go from like, we lived in a hunter-gatherer tribes, and then we're going to go to a global village where we're back in the same tribe. And there's this movement away from the individual to the tribal. However, it seems to me like I'm looking for a more complex view of the situation, or at least a new lens to the situation, because I think what's often overlooked in that narrative is the fact that the individual is an achievement of history. Like, if we go back to a situation where there's not even a way to individualize or conceptualize yourself as an individual, there's a lot of negative side effects to that, which was also brought up in the interview with McLuhan, and he responded to it in various ways. But I just like to get a sense of what both of you think about this dynamic between the individual on the one hand and the community or the tribe on the other hand, and what the role of boundary formation might be here, because I think that it's beyond the capacity for an individual human to actually identify tribally with the entire planet and to identify tribally with the entire species, which again, you get into this idea in Marx of species being. And then the other thing is like, is the individual so bad? And what's the role of differentiation, and what's the role of like, cultivating both a self and an other dynamic, which seems to me to come up in both of your speech, which is to basically create boundaries so that we have a good self relation and a good other relation and a dynamic between the two.
Yeah, I'll start on this one. Just the other day, Dave and I were kind of talking about almost this exactly, and I almost had this like realization. Maybe it wasn't such a deep realization, but at the time I was like, oh my gosh, this is brilliant. No, I think right now in our society, I especially see it as, a young woman. I see a lot of this push of be an individual, pursue your career, like you don't need anyone, no one owes you anything. And there is a lot of push on individualism. There's a lot of, I think, like anti-family sentiment that I see, that I feel, just like I said, from my perspective and my age. And so, yeah, we're kind of living in this hyper individualistic culture, which, yeah, we can weigh like the pros and cons of that. Maybe there is some benefit to encouraging people today, especially younger women, to, yeah, you don't need a man to get a credit card, to do this, to do that, as we saw, 100 years ago, where women didn't have the same autonomy and ability to just function as their own person in humanity, in society. Okay, that's good. But then on the other hand, we see, like I said, an anti-family, a very like an individualist, careerist push that makes the meaning as your life is just go be a go-getter, be the girl boss, do this, it's all you. And I think that is going to create, I think we're kind of in the middle of it, and I can't speak to anyone else's experience in the same way that we don't really know the effects of these media while we're in the environment. We're only going to find out after the fact. We're only going to find out 10, 20, 30 years down the line, when these people who have been pushed this idea that individualism is the way are in their 40s, 50s, 60s. We're going to just see how they feel about their lives. But the realization that I came to the other night was like, our lives are not meaningful, like just as human beings because we're individuals, but what makes us uniquely human as opposed to an animal who, animals are usually like, especially mammals, are like they're pack animals, they're always together, but when they're out on their own hunting or whatever, there's probably not like thoughts going through their head. They're not reflecting on their lives, their society, what they're reading. But what makes us human, the cool thing about being human, is that we do get to develop that relationship with ourselves, but that's not the only thing that we need. So I think we are relational people. I think we need to have relations, from the day we're born. We're like, we need mama, we need to be on her, we need to be with a caretaker. I think there's something innate in us that I don't necessarily want to say craves, but does a lot better, thrives with, maybe it's physical affection from a partner, from friends, just being around others. We're social creatures. So while being social creatures, the thing that makes us uniquely human is that we have the ability to develop a relationship with ourselves that other animals, that other species probably can't do. And so, yeah, when thinking about this idea of the cultural village versus smaller villages versus individualism, I kind of forgot your question, but just in terms of thinking
boundaries,
about
boundaries for the self and the
Okay.
other, and some dynamic between the self and the other. And
Mhm.
is there I agree that like if we go all the way individualistic, that's not the way to go. If we go all the way tribal, I also think there's a downside to that as well.
Right. Yeah. And so the struggle in this day and age where we have this medium or the technology kind of interfering with these two relationships, it'll be the struggle of finding the time and the space to cultivate your relationship with yourself outside of it, and then finding the time and the space to cultivate your relationship with the people around you. I think, as maybe cool or revolutionary as it is to know everything that's going on around the world and to have friends all around the world, I do think that is an overall net positive. It's like, Cadell, we wouldn't be able to talk if we didn't have this technology. Our friends that we just made in Mexico, we want to be able to keep up with them and check in on them and hear about their lives. I think that is, we're able to have friends so many other places, but to try to feel like we have to be these globally connected citizens, we can appreciate our global community and our global humanity and try to see the humanity in other people and other cultures, and just like have a base understanding without feeling like we have to advocate for every single issue that's going on in the world. Because I think it's the relationships with the people whose faces we know, whose voices we know, whether it is, through Zoom or just the people that we know in our everyday lives, are the relationships that matter the most and that we do need to focus on. So in terms of thinking about, being social and kind of getting that social fill, just going on Twitter and having Twitter conversations isn't going to cut it. Going on, talking to people through the DMs that you've never met before isn't necessarily going to cut it. And that's almost my critique of, when talking about all of this, I think we need to talk about like dating apps and Tinder and all of those. It's like that kind of muddies the line between like relationship with the other, especially in, like a sexual sense. We're all in the What is Sex course by Lenka Zupanchik. And so thinking about that also, and how this technology interferes with our sexual relations as well, is one where it's like, we used to not meet people like this. Now we're meeting people who we didn't meet face to face first. It was, we met them through text only. We just saw some selected pictures of them. And so figuring out, is this a net positive? How do we use that to create relationships? But I think it is, the relationships with the real people in our lives that we have to focus on cultivating and giving a little bit more time and attention to than just everything going on online.
I really like how you turned that back into talking about dating. On the one hand, dating is a problem today because this is like the loneliest generation, right? Like 1 in 3 millennials doesn't have any friends or something like that. Like more and more Zoomers are like just lonely, anxious, depressed. And then like the bonds that are forming are on the basis of like these algorithmically curated sort of experiments that are being conducted on the massive humans who use the technology, right? Like the users are the guinea pigs, right? And I think that because we keep saying the negative things, we have to actually reverse Virilio's famous statement. Virilio says, with the invention of the ship, you get the shipwreck. Yeah, but you also get to, go to the other side of the world. And so there's positives, like I'm sure some beautiful, loving relationships are also forming, but the amount of people lonely and turning to porn or technical devices for their gratification, instead of forming lasting bonds or relationships, that's not seemingly going down and is only getting worse. And so the part of the thing that we keep kind of circling around is this idea of like, is it a net positive? Is it a net negative? Should we be optimistic? Should we be pessimistic? And I think part of the thing is like, it's good, it's bad. We just need to understand how and in what ways it is these things, how it is useful, how it is counterproductive, and to align our expectations with the reality of the situation. And that reality is not one that we can just know without researching, right? But as far as the global village versus individuals, I just wanted to say that there is this conceptual distinction between individualism and individuals, right? I think, Cadell, that you're correct, that the individual is a special moment in history, right? That, yeah, capitalism has used that, the sort of creation of the individual, or the discovery, or the, I don't know how we want to say
value.
The value of the individual, right?
That we value the individual. Like, I mean, let me just give a very practical example is like in traditional cultures, you make, especially as a woman, you making your own determination on who you date and why was not valued. Right? Like that is, you don't choose. It's the culture, the tradition, the society, the family chooses. And I think that the modern world, and this is like the funny thing about Kant's What is Enlightenment? In the opening pages of What is Enlightenment, he's basically saying, look, you're an individual. You can think for yourself. Use the power of your own understanding. And like, I remember reading those pages and I was like, people needed to hear that. But yeah, people needed to hear that. Right? Like, so I just wanted to emphasize this because, and in the context of what I'm throwing back to you, Dave, immediately, is in the explosion of the atomic bomb, and like, all fairness to McLuhan, like he couldn't predict the future, but he was just sort of being like an artist, like intimating the future possibilities of the electronic explosion. Is like, he was predicting that we're heading back to a tribal situation, but you're saying loneliness is increasing. So like I'm just saying, like, what's going on here? I'm more just like hysterical, like I'm hysterical. Like, what's going on?
Yeah. So individualism, well, okay, so the ideology of individualism, we'll set that to the side and just say that the modernity brings about liberalism, which was not, in its classical sense, has nothing to do with Democrats, right? But has everything to do with the individual, and saying that the individual has rights, natural rights, right? And that you cannot just hang, draw, and quarter or torture somebody just because they say, I think the king is wrong, or I don't believe the Bible, right? Treason and blasphemy are concepts in traditional society across the board. Traditional societies tend to be a lot more collectivist, right? And they don't have like this robust sense of like, no, but you're an individual, right? And so, yeah, no, I mean, almost everything I say and do flies in the face of tradition. And there's a lot of people who would have me punished for that, right? In a lot of societies, and even people in our own society today. They don't like it. They don't think that I should have that freedom. They don't consider that real freedom. They consider real freedom only this. Real freedom is you choosing to follow the rules, right? And to kind of sacrifice yourself to become a cog in this greater good collective that is personified in the form of some king or some Führer or some chairman, right? So totalitarianism is a response to modern alienation and the de-tribalization that causes a lot of feelings of anxiety, right? But it also is the basis for almost everything good that we tend to take for granted. So from communism to fascism, these are responses to the situation that try to re-tribalize us, but in some mass society. Being tribalized when you know the 200 people has got to be a different experience than being tribalized by force by a state that's trying to take over the entire world. Right? That is the total mobilization of millions of people or billions of people. That is horrific as compared to the total mobilization of 200 people. Right? Well, at least you know those 200 people. And if you really fucking hate the chief in that, or somebody on the council in that tribe of 200 people, you can kill them. Like, you can actually intervene. You can just stop them. And obviously, yeah.
Shout out to Freud, totem and taboo. What up?
Take down the primal father. You can actually take down the primal father, but also your words could have an impact and actually change things, right? Like, you could politically navigate with everybody else in that situation. That's just not on the table for a mass society. But okay, so there's all these advantages to the individual, all these things that we like about the individual. Then there's individualism, which is toxic in a lot of ways. And we could get into the reasons why. I just wanted to separate the two and then say that atomization is not the same thing as the individual in its more robust sense. Like, I don't know where I've heard this, but I'm sure you've all heard it as well. But the developmental stage thing is supposed to go from dependence, you're depending on your parents, to independence, you can actually take care of yourself, to interdependence, because once you've learned how to take care of yourself, then you learn how to work with other people, right? Individualism doesn't want you to learn how to be interdependent with other people, right? It's a complete focus on the self. All success and failure comes down to the self. You're responsible for everything in life. And that's a crazy burden to bear, right? But I don't know that we even get past dependence nowadays, right? In a lot of cases. And so the hyper-atomization, though, isn't necessarily even the discovery of the individual. Right? If you're hyper-atomized and you only find yourself through being represented by some influencers that are algorithmically curated and geared towards your consumer interests, and that gives you your sense of being in the world, are you really an individual? Right? Are you really mediating between universality and particularity to flesh out and develop your singularity? No. Probably not in a lot of cases. And so to some degree you are, but how robust is it? And so, yeah, these are the kinds of problems and things that we'll be thinking about.
I really quick here want to plug, well, the shirt that I'm wearing, I actually chose this shirt for the occasion. You can't see it. It's from my favorite band, their album that came out in 2018, which was called A Brief Inquiry into Online Relationships. And so they have a particular song in this album. It's called The Man Who Married a Robot. And the song is recorded in like a robot reader voice over this almost creepy melodic music in the back. And so it's like a British male, like Siri voice speaking, like, this is the story about a lonely, lonely man. He lived in a lonely house on a lonely street, blah, blah, blah. But the internet was his friend. You could say it was his best friend. And so it goes through like telling this story of this man they would play with each other every day, watching videos of humans doing all sorts of things, having sex with each other, informing people on what was wrong with them in their lives, playing games with young children at home with their parents. And so it kind of goes through this like relationship that this man has with, it's just calling it the internet. And he says, the internet asks him, do you love me? And he says, yes, I love you very, very much. I never want us to be apart ever. And by the end of the song, after it goes through all the things that the man and the internet would do together, and they go everywhere together, it goes, so yeah, the internet says, you can tell me anything. I'm your best friend. Anything you say to me will stay strictly between you and the internet. And so he did. The man shared everything with his friend, all of his fears and desires, all of his loves, past and present, all of the places he had been and was going, and pictures of his penis. He would tell himself, man does not live by bread alone. And then he died in his lonely house, on the lonely street, in that lonely part of the world. You can go on his Facebook. And that's how the song ends. And I think that in this conversation of loneliness is like, that's it. And that's why in the chat here, I said we're a lonely tribe, is because we think we have this like tribe, we think we have community on the internet, but then in the end, if it's not with real people who are in your life every day, you die, and then who's there to remember you? It's like, you can go on his Facebook. Oh, wow, you can kind of see remnants of a real person, but you didn't actually know the real person. And so I wanted to plug that, because I think that song, now that we're in the middle of this conversation, I go, wow, this is very relevant and like haunting. It's a haunting song. It truly is. I highly recommend it. Yeah.
I'm going to check out that album after this conversation.
It's really good.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's I think it captures, to me, what I feel like. So like in this dialectic between original community, emergence of the individual, and a desire to return to an original community. I think that what's missed here is confronting loneliness and the alienation we can feel in loneliness as a positive. So what I mean by that is that it's almost a privilege to be at a time and be in a situation where we can be alienated like that, where we can experience loneliness like that. There's almost like a historical privilege that's opened up here. And I think that what's at stake in this movement, from what I like thinking of as from loneliness to aloneness, is becoming comfortable with aloneness, and from the space of being comfortable with aloneness, being more aware and selective about your tribe. So it's not like undifferentiated, we're all in the same tribe. It's that people who are comfortable with themselves alone, selectively forming tribes or networks. And those networks having a different quality to them than the original traditional tribes, because they're composed of individuated elements who in some sense have created a cultural selection, have gone through a cultural selection process in some sense. I think that the problem with that narrative, again, or at least a potential complication of that narrative, is with, for example, reproduction, building families, and all of those things. Because as soon as you engage in reproduction and building families, it seems to me you encounter those psychoanalytic dimensions like the Oedipal triangle and all sorts of other dynamics that are characteristics of tribes. But one of the things I wanted to bring up here that I think is emerging in a very interesting way in our current society and our current culture, and which is actually interestingly framed in this interview with McLuhan, is this idea of the global electronic hyper future tribe and the weird position of Africa. So like they say it many times in the interview, like I'll just give the exact quotes, is like, well, one, Africa as a representative of the original tribe. He says, you know, and talking about how Africans are now today being pulled away from their original tribal web into an alphabetic literacy, and that you know, we see in African society the original tribal society, and that they have to sacrifice their senses now in the internet age. But also this idea that in a total retribalization, that we are re-encountering, quote unquote, the Africa within. This was a quote that was brought up. And I think that that's a super interesting thing to talk about, because I think like, and especially like in the context of like American culture, because like American culture, I think in the 21st century, my hypothesis is, and then I'll throw it to you guys to get your view. My hypothesis is that 20th century American culture was based on, in some sense, a unconscious sublimation of African culture in a way that they could repress the origin of African culture. So like, for example, rock and roll with Elvis Presley, for example, like is a good example. But like in the 21st century, it's like you can't, like America can't do that anymore. So now there's just sort of an explicit open affirmation of African American culture, like hip hop being the most dominant music form, or you know, just this idea that there's some confrontation with African identity, which can no longer be repressed or somehow politically marginalized. Like, for example, with like segregation or different forms of housing code restrictions and stuff like this. I'd be interested to know, because I think this is an interesting thing to think about, because also in the context of global culture, Africa holds a very strange place. I could go into like perhaps why that is, but they were very disconnected from the history of colonial expansion, and I think are only more recently being integrated into global society. But it just comes up in this paper of the relationship between, again, high technology, global tribe, and the Africa within. Do you guys have any views on this?
No idea what to say about this. I mean, I remember thinking like, wow, I don't think that he would say that in this day and age, because we're not supposed to talk about Africa in this sort of totalizing way where it's like this, you know, it's like, oh, Africa, it's our dark past, you know, it's the dark rhythm of everybody's past or something. Like this is the kind of way that people would talk about it back then. And obviously Africa is a very diverse continent with a lot of different kinds of cultures and everything like that. And so it's sort of totalization is generally one of like, oh, they're backward savages, or they're the enlightened, like noble savages who really were more in touch with how life is supposed to be. And any kind of backwardness that we might perceive today is a mere product of colonization, of slavery, of, you know, all of this other stuff. And then, of course, if you zoom in and actually look at it, the history is a lot more complicated, right? Because people are complicated and they're people. And so I guess the main thing is just like he seems to romanticize the tribe in this way that like Rousseau does, in this way that you're saying that Marx did. I don't know if Marx did it so much as like, I think he was kind of interested in the anthropology of his time, but he wasn't basing the stuff that he did on that anthropology. I think he took it critically with a grain of salt. And Engels was the one who was trying to make a political ontology out of anthropology of his time and adapt it to Marxism. And so for Engels, no, the prehistoric tribal communal man, it's all the same. They all are egalitarian. And that was something broadly believed in at the time. And it's also something that anthropologists tended to believe. at the time. And a lot of times those anthropologists were leftists, and they thought that to make real change, people needed to have a new idea of what human nature is. And so what we do is we go and we look at tribal societies, and we call them prehistoric, right? As though when we go to visit some tribe, we're going back in time, even though, of course, they live right now. This is just, they're concurrent with us. And so it's all complicated, but I would just say that, like, I think you already touched on it. And of course, Cadell, you've got the background in anthropology, academically speaking, so maybe you can expand on it a little bit. But these were war-torn societies already, right?
African societies, yeah.
Thousands of years.
Yeah, they're very, very, very complex tribal societies. I wanted to situate it in the context of this. And in the context of the article, they're basically saying Western societies are atomized, individualistic, and African societies are tribal, and that we're going back to a global tribe, and that this brings, like they're saying, the Africa within. And I see like this still in our thought. Like I still see, like, for example, let me just give a concrete example, is in Daniel Tutt's recent book on the psychoanalysis of the family. In the last chapter, he talks about how we should learn from the Black family about like the individualistic white, like basically individualistic white America can learn from the Black family as a model for breaking out of the nuclear family or something like that, like to reestablish the extended family or something like that. This idea that somehow African culture is more connected to the tribe than the rest of society. I don't know if that has any legitimate currency to it, but it's just something that comes up in this article, and I wanted to see if you guys had any views on it.
Yeah, I think Dave and you both kind of got into it, because this is a tough one to struggle with, especially in the age of, like, you kind of have to be PC when you're a white person talking about race or Africa.
I think that's a symptom of it.
Yeah, I think a little bit. Yeah. So, I, as an individual, we can't really necessarily say, oh, going back to this is a good thing or not. I think there's benefits, as we've already been talking about. There's benefits to being in a small tribe or a medium-sized tribe. There's benefits to being an individual and cultivating a relationship with your individual self. But I definitely do see today the idea, kind of like you said, with like the example you gave, people putting values on ways of life as like, this is the way to do it. And then another example that came to my mind, kind of similar, is in the last few years, I've seen multiple times people who are like activists sharing infographics on their Instagram or whatever, saying these are characteristics of white supremacy culture, and we need to, so in turn being the opposite would be like a more racially diverse culture would be the opposite of these things, but the characteristics of white supremacy culture, things like perfectionism, paternalism, individualism, progress equals bigger thinking, defensiveness, worship of the written word. I think that one's especially really relevant in this case. Objectivity. And so under that,
this is what I'm talking about.
Yeah. So under that, which I don't know if I necessarily agree with this being
like white supremacist culture is literate, or like
yeah. I mean, I've even seen yeah, it's terrible to like characterize people on the basis of their skin color as, oh, if you're a perfectionist, it's like, okay, I grew up like perfectionism ingrained in my mind. Oh no, I'm perpetuating white supremacy because I wanted to get A's on my report card. And maybe there's some merit into like saying, oh, well, just like blanket perfectionism or blanket objectivity or blanket individualism are not good things, but to root it in like a race or racial supremacy or fascism is interesting, and it's very touchy. But yeah, I think what Dave said, human beings are so complicated in the ways that we live our lives based on our culture, but only like our physical location and just how we develop as societies and as cultures and as tribes. I don't know if we can really just say like, oh, good, bad, here, this, African tribal is good and this white supremacist individualism is bad, because as McLuhan talks about in this interview, as some of the books that I've been reading, as we've all been talking about, there's pros and cons to both of it. And so I think, yeah, this is a really interesting and tough point in the interview to struggle with, especially in our current, BLM activism age.
The problem with essentializing racial characteristics in this way, I like how Nance says this in his piece that's going to be included in the forthcoming Underground Theory volume. That is, it also has pieces by all of us. But he says that the problem with this kind of racial essentialism is that as soon as you start saying that certain groups of people are naturally better at certain kinds of things, you're also out the other side of your mouth insinuating that certain groups of people are also just worse at certain kinds of things, right? And this is the kind of racism that you will deal with as a Native American or as a Black person in the United States, growing up in a Native American or Black community, especially a poorer community, where if you are reading, you actually take reading seriously, you'll get bullied for it, told, oh, you're being white. Right now, if you're a white kid and you're reading and taking your reading seriously, you're probably going to get bullied for it anyway. Like, people are going to call you a nerd. People are, like, why are you doing that? Why don't you just play sports? You stupid nerd. And of course, like, we're all athletic in our own ways, and we don't really buy into this binary between these two things, but children do. And the problem with being a Native American or Black kid is that not only do you get bullied for it like the white kid, but now it's also being racialized. They're now telling you that you've internalized the oppressor, that you've internalized whiteness. That is itself a form of racism, right? It's something that John McWhorter talks about in his book, Losing the Race. It's something that I think Dr. Adolph Reed talks about, but it's also something that Frederick Douglass, well, I'm not sure if he talked about this expressly, but the reason I want to bring Frederick Douglass into it is, like, in the life and times of Frederick Douglass, like, one of the first freed slaves who was a public intellectual and had a huge influence on the emancipation of slavery, or like the abolition of slavery and the emancipation of slaves. Frederick Douglass, his account of going from slavery to freedom, it's also, it's not just about economic and material impoverishment, right? It's more about the impoverishment of the soul and of human spirit and its ability to be a historic creature that knows that has some sense of the world beyond immediacy, right? And his fight to become literate is one of the most moving accounts in the history of the written word, right? So Frederick Douglass, I see Frederick Douglass as absolutely essential for thinking about the power of literacy. He didn't just learn to be literate so that he could convince the white master to free him, or to convince the broader white society that he's a person too. Like, that's something that he does do. But no, being literate is a value unto its own self, right? And it's something that he's like, there's probably no more powerful voice for describing it. But on the Native American side, I just wanted to kind of point out that this is a constant sort of through line in everything that Sherman Alexie writes, right? Sherman Alexie's kind of from my area of the United States in the Pacific Northwest. He grew up probably an hour away from where I grew up, in Spokane, Washington, on the reservation there. And he was also bullied for caring about books. And the way that he learned how to read, it was actually kind of crazy. He didn't have formal instruction. He picked up books off the shelf, and he and he just obsessed over them and he taught himself how to read. I don't know. He describes it in a book called Superman and Me or something like that. So anyway, Sherman Alexie, Frederick Douglass, John McWhorter, I think these are, a few of the people who got marginalized within their already marginalized communities because they were being called white for wanting to do these things. But I just want to say, most white people don't fucking read, right? Most white people don't read either. And, these are already problematic categories, problematic groupings. But the point is like Americans in general are on TikTok not reading books. And if they are reading books, they're still functionally illiterate in the sense that they don't know how to read that book from multiple perspectives and interpret it critically. So, it's a dying art form. But every art form has something to offer. And I think that being literate has more to offer in terms of liberation than anything else, because the most brutal form of slavery is potentially, in a world where we think that of slavery has been abolished, it's not knowing what you're doing and not having any critical distance from the things that you say, do, or believe, right? It makes you just an extension of the will of others, and you don't know who or why or to what end. And so, but anyway, that's kind of what came up for me.
I think just winding down, just gonna give a reflection from the end of the article that I think actually points a little bit to what you're doing, and I think to what I'm trying to do as well, in regards to the ethics of engaging in this transformation or this post-atomic bomb electronic media. He says that what he means, this is McLuhan, what he means by understanding media is that they extend man, and that the vital task is that literate man would now plunge himself into the vortex of electronic technology to dictate his new environment. And in some sense, I see that as, he's talking about this being the literate people in the universities should take the leap into the electronic technology and go into the vortex and try to create a new world out of it. And I see in some sense, both of us or all of us have had some exposure to academic structure, to, let's say, cultivating a sense of literacy. And now our task is to plunge into the vortex of electronic technology and try to create a new world in this new situation, as opposed to recoiling against it and being scared of it. And I think that, just before I throw it to you, I think that a course like digital literacy and critical media theory is necessary to take that plunge, and also make sense why you're teaching that in the context of the metaphorical plunge into the vortex. So maybe just get a sense of, what you think we should be doing, or how you think we should be interpreting this ethos that McLuhan's communicating in the context of, say, Theory Underground, in the context of, say, this course.
Sure, I'll start here really quick by saying that, firstly, when talking about these people or these activists, both in McLuhan's age and then now, who say, oh yeah, we need to go back to this model of African tribalism or what have you, I'm sympathetic to this type of activism in the sense that they see something that is different than what we're currently in, that maybe to them seems better. And so they're trying to grasp onto this example of something that seemed to work, that seemed to be, less harmful or better for individuals, in the same way that, we have some friends who are Marxists and they just cling so hardly onto like the 1917 revolution and Bolshevism, that, that worked. And so I'm sympathetic because it's a model that we have to grasp onto and to take examples from. But then my critique of that, and that's, I think, why we are teaching this course right now in this current day and age, is things have changed so much that we can no longer just just say, oh, this model worked, this model works, we should just redo this model, because everything has changed. The technology has changed. Our situation is very different than the time of McLuhan, the time of Neil Postman in the 80s. So we're in a very, unique period of time with the technology. And so in terms of, using McLuhan's sentiment, I think what Dave and I are trying to do here with this course, I also see in more broadly what you and Dave are both doing with your respective platforms, Philosophy Portal and Theory Underground, is we're like taking charge of this technology in a sense. We're using it to understand it. We can't be completely outside of it, just practically speaking, but then also in terms of trying to understand it, we need to experiment with it, tarry with it, try and fail, and really use it in that way. And so McLuhan is definitely the starting point. I'm really excited to kind of get more into it. Dave will really be taking the charge of leading the McLuhan part of our first session that starts here in a few weeks. But that is what I have to say about that. Thank you.
I think the thing that we haven't talked about, and that maybe is a nice way of closing this out, is that in the same way that we can say that everything's changed and we live in a different world now, we can also say that when we read these authors, we're profoundly impacted by how ahead of their time they were. And I know, like, when Anne was reading Neil Postman and his focus is on television, it's crazy how much of what he says is still applicable with TikTok, but like more so, right? And so I think that when people think of philosophy in the United States, they think of either like analytic philosophy, logical paradoxes, maybe they think about, oh, that's Plato and Aristotle arguing, walking around Athens in togas. Or they kind of have this, there's a couple other visions that people have. One is like the sort of evangelical Christian, God's not dead, atheist professor who wants everybody to write God is dead before the class can continue, right? He's this dogmatic sort of atheist. And in this kind of characterization of philosophy is nothing but worldview. And that, whatever the professor is teaching is just to get everyone else to believe their worldview. But you're lucky if you think that, because at least that can change, that can be changed. But if you think that philosophy is the spirituality and UFO section at the Barnes and Noble, you're fucked, right? Like this is the conception of philosophy right now. Like if you go to any bookstore in the United States, it's almost always like there's the UFOs and New Age spirituality, and then you might find Kant's Critique of Pure Reason if you're lucky, right? It's probably going to be some Alain de Botton or whatever, the school of
Alain de Botton.
Alain de Botton, yeah, school of life.
Alain de Botton.
Alain de Botton, yeah. So part of the goal of Theory Underground is to set the record straight, to help people get familiarized with something that's been relegated to a niche academic interest, and to help people kind of come into philosophy and theory in a way that makes it relevant to their lives. And one of the things that I've seen over the last 12 years that I've been studying philosophy is people are profoundly impacted by philosophy when they see that, whether it was 2,500 years ago or 200 years ago, that philosopher is saying something that they've thought themselves in they thought the first 2 steps to the thought, but they didn't think the following 5 steps to that thought, right? Like, oh, I keep having this thought, but I never think it through to its end. And I haven't really clarified it or worked it out in any kind of sophisticated way. And oh my fucking God, Plato just did that, or Kant just did that. And it's not just this abstract speculative nonsense that's now null and void because of the advances of science, like someone like Steven Pinker would say. No, it has bearing on our life right now. And people find that to be incredibly powerful. It's why you hear people say, and he said, I say he because it's usually a he, and he said that back then. He was saying this at that time, right? So I think that anything that gets people saying that about a philosopher, about philosophy in general, is a bridge to bringing people into philosophy and theory. And I'm interested in regular working people discovering concepts that help them make sense of their lives and give them some kind of liberation from the dogmatic ideological immediacy that they've taken for granted, right? So we're about to go on tour across the United States. I know Philosophy Portal is big on doing real life events as well. And we've both talked about doing kind of festival-like events in the future. I know you're exploring those kinds of possibilities right now actively. And that's really exciting because we have, like, I think that at a time when people are so over it, they're so over the academic specialization, compartmentalization, and hyper niche, seemingly unrelated to normal life research interests. And they're also over the general discourse, the news media, the kinds of things that people, worldview salesmen from business, religion, or politics are constantly feeding us as solutions to problems that are actually a lot more complicated than they're ever actually dealt with. Like, people, I do think, maybe not everybody, but a lot of people are hungry for philosophy and theory. And I think that we might be way ahead of our time. We might be ahead of our time by 5 years, by 15 years, by 50 years. But I do believe that there is a renaissance in the works. And I do believe that we are early sort of inventors and pioneers on the forefront of something that is bridging the internet and the real world, that is bridging academia and public philosophy. And I think that the inroads we want to make for people to get into this stuff have to be things that are stuff that we currently struggle with. And I think that cell phone addiction and loneliness and distraction is probably one of the best inroads to going, oh my God, Hannah Arendt, Martin Heidegger, Karl Marx, Marshall McLuhan, Jean Baudrillard, Virilio. All these fucking people have so much to say about what's going on right now. And they were saying this stuff 50 to 100 years ago, right? So that's what I really hope that this will do, is at least bring in a few people to philosophy and theory who've never taken it seriously, and really turn on some light bulbs for the rest of their lives. Give them something that they can find spiritual, intellectual nourishment from.
Fantastic. All right, so final point, the digital literacy and critical media theory class will start Sunday, June 11th. It will run for 6 months. They'll be meeting, like I said, once a month. So it's not going to be a super extensive time commitment in terms of your weekly participation, but it will be a long-term mediation, which will involve your active, reflective engagement with your own relationship to technology. If you want, in the context of this in the context of this conversation, your own relationship to the atomic bomb that is new media. And I think that, you know, the lectures which will be a part of the course will give you that conceptual background that Dave was talking about, that philosophical framing that might help you approach practical problems in your own life, which otherwise you might not have the tools to deal with. And here we had a conversation about McLuhan, which hopefully gives you a window into the types of things you might want to be brainstorming now in preparation for the course. So again, links to all of that will be in the description. Theory Underground is where you're going to want to go. And on that note, Dave, Anne, thanks so much. Any final just send-offs before we shut down here?
Yeah, I'll just really quick say thank you so much for having us on and having this conversation with us. I'm really glad we all got the opportunity to talk about this article because I'm kind of newer to reading McLuhan. And I already just see with kind of the base that I have from this article, from a little bit of understanding media, that how important Marshall McLuhan is to this conversation. And so I'm super excited to dive into that more and then relate it to some more practical application into our daily lives. And so we encourage people to look into the course, sign up for it. There's 4 different tiers all on the Theory Underground website. And yeah, thank you again for having us.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. It's theory-underground.com. Click on courses. The rest is self-explanatory. Hopefully, register with the site. Make sure to look at your spam folder because a lot of times the confirmation email goes there. But the thing I think I want to leave people to think about that I was kind of hinting on when I talked about setting our expectations more based in reality in terms of our survival. Yeah, it's good to do extreme things like get rid of your smartphone and just use a flip phone for a while. That's something both Anne and I have experimented with on our own at various points. It's good to experiment with all kinds of things. And obviously nowadays people experiment with diets and various exercise routines all the time. This is what podcasts tend to focus on. But what I want to leave people with to think about is that a lot of these ideals we have of reading books in some traditional way, etc. Some of them might be unrealistic expectations. Now, obviously, we're keeping the books alive, right? We at Philosophy Portal and Theory Underground, we believe in it. But I'm starting to think that in some ways, instead of just being oh, I'm so distracted, I'm trying to learn how to focus. I'm trying to learn how to focus. I'm trying to learn how to focus like I've been for the last 10 years. Instead being I'm hyper distracted. And I've developed some strategies for learning anyway. Not so that I can become a person who's not hyper distracted, but so that I can be a hyper distracted person and still learn, right? And so part of this is trying to understand what we are now. Not necessarily so that we can become who we were supposed to be or who we actually supposedly were in the past. I don't know. That's just something I want to leave people with so that we're not just seen as people who are romanticizing old texts. I do believe that texts are important, but we can listen to books now. That's different. You know what I mean? And it kind of brings us back to the orality of texts that was there in the medieval times when you would sit with the master who reads the book and you would take the notes, right? Now I'm washing the dishes while I'm listening to books or lectures. And maybe it's not as good, but maybe there's also something that is good about that. Something that lays a radical groundwork for something beyond a class society where some people are supposed to read and other people are not supposed to think about big ideas, but are just supposed to work. So thanks so much for having us on, Cadell.
All right. With that, as Dave said, theory-underground.com, courses, the rest should be self-explanatory. And again, links will be all in the description. So thanks so much, Dave. Thanks so much, Anne. This has been Digital Literacy and Critical Media Theory, a little window into that course through a conversation about Marshall McLuhan. And I hope everyone has a great evening.